Bibbings, and as Karen said, I'm Professor of Law, Gender and History at the University of Bristol. I'm also working locally as a member of 2 history groups, and some of this, what I'm going to be talking about, comes out of that work, Remembering the Real World War I and Bristol Radical History Group. And I'm going to be talking first of all about the national picture, and by national I mean Britain, because conscription didn't apply to the whole of the UK, to Ireland. I wanted to start with a little bit of background, just to give you a sense of me. I became involved in looking at conscientious objection over 30 years ago now because of the man in the centre of that screen, my father, who was a conscientious objector to national service in the late 1940s, just after the Second World War. And there you have a sentence of his presentation to his tribunal, which was his first trip to Bristol, actually, to actually appear before the tribunal. So since then I've written articles, given many talks over the years, and published a book on the picture in England, telling tales about men, and done local work, including the Refusing to Kill booklet on the other side of the screen there. So when the First World War started, we had by this stage a tradition of about a century of a professional army supplemented by volunteers when needed. And this was a really strong tradition, such that when the war was declared, the idea of conscription was incredibly unpopular. It was seen as something that was foreign, European, and even Prussian. And in fact, there was no need, because many men, some who were overage and some underage boys, rushed to join up in the initial days, weeks and months. And that sort of enthusiasm, or supposed enthusiasm, by some of the population, it was guided by also unemployment, the need for work and money, so more complex than just talking about that kind of traditional narrative, was spurred on by propaganda, such as the poster we're very familiar with in the centre of that screen. As the months went on, though, it became clear that with increasing fatalities and woundings and news coming home about the realities of war, that the numbers were not sufficient in terms of the government's and the military's view. So various strategies were used to try and to work out what was going on. So in the summer of 1915, a national register was taken, a special kind of census of all the population, boys and girls, women and men, between the ages of 15 and 65, to get a sense of who wasn't in the military, who could join the military, and also who could step into the jobs they'd leave behind. So this was partly a manpower and woman power management exercise, ensuring the right people, the right men, step forward. That was followed in the autumn of 1915 by what was known as the Derby scheme. This was a kind of incentive scheme which allowed men to attest their willingness to serve if needed. So it wasn't a joining up, it was a sort of halfway house where men would be paid a small sum for doing so in terms of a reward. But as we approached the end of 1915, it became clear that the government was looking at conscription, and over the Christmas period, the then coalition cabinet started talking about a draft bill to put before the Houses and to become an act. And by the beginning of 1916, it was introduced, and the first of what was to be a series of military service acts passed on the 26th of January. The act applied, as you can see there from a very brief snapshot of it, to men who were ordinary resident in Great Britain. A conscription never applied to Ireland, who had attained the age of 18 but were not yet 41, and were either unmarried or a widower without a dependent child. This was soon expanded to include all men in that age bracket, and subsequent acts sort of changed things slightly along the way as well, with some emergency powers introduced in the last Military Service Act in 1918. But there you have the basic formula. But as I started by saying, Britain at this time had a tradition of voluntarism, and it's very much tied up with the national identity. And there was still some resistance to the whole idea of any kind of military compulsion. which meant that the Act included the kind of exceptions and exemptions you might expect: ministers of religion, for those who were not fit to serve actively, and for those who were judged to be best able to work towards the war effort on the home front. But part of a compromise to get the bill that became the Military Service Act through was a conscience clause, a clause that allowed for men to apply to a tribunal for exemption from the terms of the Act on the grounds of conscience objection to competent service. So quite an extraordinary idea, the sense that you have a universal measure which allows an exception of something that can't be proved. So the idea would be a man would apply for exemption to a tribunal system and would ask for a certificate of exemption to be granted, which could be partial, meaning he was in the military but in a non-combatant role, in the non-combatant corps, or possibly in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Conditional exemption meant exemption on the basis that an individual was undertaking some kind of approved work of national importance on the land, for example, in food production or munitions. Or exemption could be absolute. And a lot has been written about the record of the tribunals, particularly in relation to conscience objectors and how sympathetic or unsympathetic they were. Certainly a mixed bag in terms of their approach. So we come to the conscience objectors, of which there were about 20,000 as far as we know. There's no centralised record, there's no one record of who they were. They objected on religious, political and or moral grounds. And you can see a cartoon on the left of your screen from Punch in the beginning of 1916, just after the Act was passed, but before it was in force. And in the centre of the screen, two conscience objectors fighting each other. So the first misconception, I think, to just address at this stage is just the idea that all conscience objectors were pacifists. They were by no means all pacifists, so some absolutely were. So on the other side of the screen, there's a quote from a conscience objector of the time, Langdon Davis. And quite a lengthy quote, but I think it illustrates the variety of positions and the complexity of the situation. So there were class war men, he says, who had no objection to killing, but it depended who they were killing. They didn't want to kill their fellow workers. So kind of idea of political objectors, socialists, but right through to anarchists. Those who would have no part, and those who would compromise in different ways in terms of what they would or wouldn't do. And it could become quite a complex decision for men, working out what they might accept, what they wouldn't accept. So some might accept working in munitions, others would shun that. Some might be prepared to replace a man to go to the front, others would find that too direct a contribution to the war effort. So the idea of complexity and not agreement between objectors in terms of the basis of their objection, but also how they would react to being called up. So that means we have to trace a trajectory in terms of what conscience objectors did and what happened to them. So I'm going to just present a fairly straightforward, well, a fairly complex picture, but in as a straightforward a way as I possibly can. So at the top of the screen, some men applied for exemption to the tribunals and obtained a level of exemption they were happy with, and so ended up in the non-combatant corps or maybe doing some kind of alternative national work of national importance. There were those who applied for exemption and were refused, or were granted a level of exemption they weren't prepared to accept, that wasn't acceptable in terms of their consciences. And they would be arrested, tried before magistrates, fined and handed over to the military, where if they continued to refuse to obey orders, they might be punished and some were tortured and be court-martialed in the end, incarcerated. They were initially incarcerated in military detention centres, but then gradually moved over into the civilian prison system. And some were offered the possibility at that stage of taking part in work on what was known as the Home Office scheme, which meant they largely went to camps around the country, one of which was, for example, at Dartmoor Prison, which had been deprisoned for the war. And they do work on the land, quarrying, building walls, for example. And then there were men who applied for exemption and refused to accept what was given. And they ended up being court-martialed in the military, held in civilian prisons on sometimes repeated sentences, but refusing to cooperate, refusing to accept the Home Office scheme or to cave in. And these were the absolutists who spent their war in civilian prisons. Going towards the bottom of the screen, there were also men who went on the run, who at some point, either initially or perhaps when they were being handed over from military authorities to prison, or back from prison to the military, or when they were on the Home Office scheme, evaded the authorities and went underground. And some actually made it as far as Ireland, where there was no conscription, or to the US even. There were also COs who changed their minds and became soldiers. And there were soldiers who changed their mind and tried to become COs, a very difficult path to tread, it has to be said. So a really complex picture in terms of motivation and in terms of what men were prepared to do and what happened to them. And what I hope begins to come across there is that this was a shifting picture in terms of what the government was offering these men. There was compromise and change, particularly in terms of managing public opinion. It was important, it was felt throughout the war that conscientious objectors wouldn't be treated too leniently, but also not too harshly either, particularly religious objectors, because that might arouse sympathies for them. How were COs viewed and treated? A few images here at the top of the screen. We have maybe the more stereotypical images from Union Jack magazine, that kind of idea of cowardice, pinning a white feather on a man not in uniform, a conscious objector. On the top right-hand side of the screen, the sort of effeminate camp image of an objector, an unmanly kind of idea of what an objector was, far from the ideal of the heroic soldier. And in the middle, a kind of idea of objector as suspicious, as being looked at as an outsider, as possibly being unpatriotic or even a German spy. At the bottom, we have very different ideas about how objectors were seen. So the image there from Micklewright is the kind of objector in prison looking at the socialist idea, so an idealized form of manliness, and the objector as heroic. And here we're looking obviously at a supporters and CO standpoint, very different one. And really important to acknowledge that COs had their supporters, had people who worked very actively with them on their behalf and led, whilst many were unable to leave for themselves, being incarcerated, for example. The most significant organisation in the period was the No Conscription Fellowship, and it produced, for example, this weekly publication, The Tribunal, which, despite state efforts to stop its publication, was published every week throughout the war. So heroism versus cowardliness, a complex sense of ideas, and a sense that COs were not by no means entirely ostracised. Very briefly, final slide, because I'm going to pick up this on in the second part of my talk, focusing on Bristol with more concrete examples. After the war, some conscious objectors thrived, and some found themselves rejected by sometimes parts of their family and their community, and found it hard to obtain jobs. And as I say, I'll give examples when I talk more specifically about the Bristol area. So there I'll leave the first part of the talk and stop sharing